The year was 1346, and the air in Europe still carried the fragrance of ripened fields and warm bread, untainted by the scent of fear that would soon come. The continent pulsed with life. Bells rang in distant abbeys, their echoes gliding over quiet rivers and winding cobblestone lanes. Beneath banners stitched with gold thread, kings dined in candlelight, surrounded by laughter that trembled against the vaulted ceilings of their great halls. The world, for now, seemed unbreakable, a shimmering tapestry of prosperity and pride, unaware that its threads were already fraying beneath the surface. Inside one such castle, light spilled from tall windows like liquid amber, touching the polished wood of long dining tables. The walls were draped in velvet, deep crimson and blue, colors that whispered of wealth and conquest. Silver goblets glimmered between the flicker of torches, and servants moved silently, their soft steps echoing against the stone. The smell of roasted fowl, honeyed almonds, and warm bread filled the air. Somewhere beyond the music and the murmur of voices, the faint toll of a church bell marked the passing of another golden evening. At the center of this world sat the royal family, their presence both serene and formidable. The king lifted his cup, its rim shining like the sun. Around him, courtiers raised theirs in silent imitation. The queen, her gown shimmering like moonlight on water, smiled faintly as a musician's lute traced a melody through the air, a melody that sounded like eternity. It was a time of order, of certainty, when faith ruled the heart and power ruled the land. The great feast was not merely a meal, it was a declaration that the world was stable, that the heavens themselves had blessed the hierarchy of man. Outside the walls, the kingdom pulsed with equal vigor. Farmers guided oxen through damp fields, unaware that the very soil they turned would soon cradle the dead. Merchants crossed bridges with carts heavy with grain and barrels of ale, calling out to one another beneath the gray dawn. Blacksmiths hammered sparks into the cold morning air, shaping iron with the rhythm of survival. Children played near wells, their laughter clear as the water that glimmered at the bottom. The hum of life was steady, almost eternal, as if nothing could ever disturb its rhythm. But if one listened closely, beyond the laughter and the ringing of bells, there were whispers, the subtle breath of change that slipped through the cracks of comfort. In the ports of Genoa, sailors told of ships arriving from the east, carrying strange cargo and stranger silence. In Venice, traders spoke in hushed tones about the price of spices rising suddenly, as if the world's supply had begun to vanish. Yet for now, such murmurs were far away, buried beneath the music of feasts and the steady turning of the seasons. No one believed that death could travel unseen. As twilight deepened, torches were lit along the castle walls, painting the courtyard in soft amber. The scent of pine smoke curled into the cool air. Above, the sky shimmered with the last glow of day, and stars began to appear, small, innocent lights, unaware of what they would soon witness. The castle, alive with song and the clinking of goblets, seemed to pulse like a living heart. Each sound, each voice, each bite of food was part of a ritual older than memory itself, the rhythm of human celebration before catastrophe. The feast began in splendor. Silver platters carried roasted peacocks, their feathers restored and gilded with gold leaf. There were spiced wines from Gascony, venison soaked in sweet sauces, and delicate pastries filled with almonds and dates. Laughter rippled across the table like waves of light. To dine was to be alive, and to eat well was to affirm one's place in the divine order. Every flavor, every texture was a statement of gratitude and dominance, that the world was vast, and yet its riches belonged here, to this hall, to this table. The servants, trained in silent precision, moved as shadows between the guests. They filled goblets before they were empty, replaced dishes before hunger had even stirred. The great hall glowed brighter with each passing moment. The hum of conversation rose, mixing with the deep tones of a pipe organ echoing from the chapel beyond. It was a feast of rhythm and harmony, a symphony of taste and sound that lulled even the most restless mind into the illusion that the world would never change. And in that illusion, people slept easily, as though time itself bowed before them. Beyond the castle gates, the night air carried a chill from the east. Dogs barked faintly in the distance, their voices swallowed by wind. The moon cast its pale glow upon the empty road, where a single cart creaked through the darkness. The driver, wrapped in coarse cloth, urged his horses onward. He was a merchant, returning from a port far to the south. In his cart lay barrels of goods, grain, salt, and cloth. Hidden among them, wrapped in canvas, were things unseen, fleas clinging to rags, a sickness yet unnamed. No one at the castle knew, and no one could. Inside the walls, music played on. For now, the world was whole. The fields were green, the rivers clear, and the scent of bread rose from ovens like prayer. Bells still marked the hours, unbroken by panic. In the flickering glow of 1,000 candles, kings toasted to peace and prosperity, and the people below their walls worked and sang, believing that tomorrow would be just the same. The sky above them was wide and calm, and the stars, though distant, seemed to bless their comfort. But history was waiting, patient, silent, hidden in the dust of a caravan road, in the breath of a rat, in the unseen dance of time. The forgotten feast glowed bright before the darkness. It was the last breath of a world that still believed in its own eternity, the final banquet before silence. As laughter rose through the golden halls, and music tangled with the smoke of burning spices, the world turned quietly toward its reckoning. The Black Death had not yet arrived, but its shadow had begun to stretch across the earth, unseen and unstoppable. And somewhere, in the stillness between one note of the lute and the next, history exhaled, softly, almost kindly, before the light began to fade. The royal table was far more than a place to eat. It was a stage, a throne in itself, and each meal served upon it was an act of theater performed for gods and men alike. Long before a single dish was set down, every detail of the feast had been planned with deliberate care. The height of the table, the arrangement of seats, the order of the courses. Nothing was left to chance. The royal table was a living symbol, a declaration of hierarchy carved in oak and silver, where every bite carried the weight of power. To dine before the court was to remind all who watched that the king ruled not only by sword and decree, but by the very act of eating. As the candles flickered to life and the air filled with the sweet scent of beeswax, servants in embroidered tunics began the procession. They carried trays of polished pewter and goblets of gold, their steps measured, their eyes cast down. At the far end of the hall, the monarch sat elevated above all others, upon a dais draped in silk. The placement of that seat was not a mere convenience, it was a message. From that height, the king could see all, and all could see him. The queen sat beside him, her gown reflecting the glow of torchlight, her crown a constellation of gemstones that caught the breath of every guest. To dine in their presence was to participate in the sacred order of the world, heaven above, nobility below, the earth's bounty stretched out between them. The meal began with bread, as it always did. To break bread at the king's table was to affirm unity and faith. It was blessed by the chaplain, whose low voice echoed through the vast chamber, his words carried upward like smoke. Only after that blessing could the feast truly begin. Great loaves, crusted and warm, were passed down the table, each person tearing a piece in ritual silence. For the poor, bread was survival. For the royal, it was symbol, the body of order, the structure of the kingdom itself. Even the act of holding it was an acknowledgement of divine favor. Then came the meats. Platters of roasted venison, boar, and swan were carried forth in slow procession. Each animal had been chosen not merely for taste, but for meaning. The stag represented courage and nobility, the boar strength and ferocity, the swan purity and grace. To eat these creatures was to consume their virtues, to embody the ideals of rulership. The king would carve the first slice himself, his knife glinting under candlelight, and the hall would fall silent as the blade met the flesh. It was not hunger that drew eyes to the food, but reverence. The act was ceremonial, a reminder that even in abundance, hierarchy was sacred. Music accompanied each course. Flutes, lutes, and small drums filled the hall with gentle rhythm, guiding the motion of servants and guests alike. The feast was a choreography, a dance of power and obedience. Courtiers watched every gesture of the royal family, imitating their poise, their silence, their laughter. Even the smallest act, a lifted goblet, a nod of approval, carried weight. To spill wine or speak out of turn was not merely rude, it was a breach in the sacred order. The rules of the table were as strict as those of battle, and those who broke them risked exile from the king's favor. The feast was not indulgence, it was discipline in disguise. Each dish had a story. The spiced pies were filled with raisins from Spain and cloves from the east, ingredients that had traveled through ports, deserts, and war zones to reach this moment. The sweet almond milk that accompanied them had been ground by hand, its scent delicate as prayer. Even the salt, glimmering white in carved bowls, had once been more valuable than gold. To sprinkle it upon one's food was to summon the world itself, a connection between distant lands and the hungry mouths of the court. The table was a map of empire, each flavor a reminder of conquest and commerce. The monarch did not need to travel to rule, the world came to him, one plate at a time. But beneath the splendor lay something deeper, a hunger that could never be satisfied. Each course grew grander, more complex, as if the kingdom itself feared silence. Feasts stretched for hours, sometimes into the next dawn. Wine flowed until torches burned low, and still new dishes appeared, pheasant stuffed with herbs, eels baked in honey, pies shaped like castles. It was not gluttony, though it looked like it. It was power translated into form. The abundance was proof that the world obeyed the crown, that no famine, no storm, no rebellion could touch the royal plate. Every morsel was a declaration of control over nature, over man, over time. And yet, there was an unspoken fragility in the ritual. The more elaborate the feast became, the more it revealed its dependence on unseen hands. The farmers who plowed the fields, the cooks who labored in the smoky kitchens, the merchants who risked their lives on treacherous roads, all played their part, though none would ever taste what they had helped create. The royal table was built on invisible labor, its beauty resting upon the backs of those who would never see it. To the guests above, it was majesty. To those below, it was a dream glimpsed through a crack in the door. Still, within the hall, that truth was easy to forget. The air shimmered with warmth and laughter. The music swelled, and the light from 100 candles danced across goblets filled with ruby-colored wine. The courtiers leaned close, whispering stories of foreign lands, of wars fought and won, of alliances sealed by marriage and faith. The king listened, sometimes smiling faintly, sometimes lost in thought. To outsiders he seemed eternal, untouched by worry or hunger. Yet even he, beneath the crown and silken robe, must have felt the passing of time, the slow erosion that no feast could hide. Power was a performance, and like all performances, it depended on the audience's belief. As the final course arrived, a gilded pudding of almonds and honey, adorned with silver leaf, the air seemed to still. The courtiers waited for the king's nod before raising their spoons. The sweetness lingered on their tongues like memory itself. Outside, the night wind rustled through the castle's banners, a low whisper against the stone. Within, everything glowed, the gold, the laughter, the pride. The royal table had once again fulfilled its purpose, to remind those present of the order of the world, of the divine favor that had placed them here, above others. To dine was to reign, and to reign was to feast. When the last candle flickered low and the servants began to clear the tables, the scent of wine and roasted meat lingered in the air, thick and drowsy. The king rose, his robes sweeping softly across the floor. The guests bowed their heads as he passed, their eyes lowered, their thoughts full of envy, loyalty, and awe. The hall emptied slowly, the echoes of laughter fading into the high rafters. The table, now bare and silent, gleamed faintly in the dying light, a relic of power, a mirror of order. And though none could see it yet, that same silence would one day return not from fullness, but from absence. For even the grandest tables must one day be cleared, and every feast, no matter how splendid, must end. Before the feast began, before the torches were lit or the goblets raised, the story of royal food had already been written across the land, in fields and forges, in merchant ships and muddy roads. Each meal that graced the king's table was the culmination of countless unseen hands, a vast and intricate web of labor that stretched from the far edges of the known world to the quiet kitchens of the castle. The royal feast was not born in the hall, it was born in the soil, in the sweat of those who never saw the gleam of gold or the shimmer of silk. Every bite carried the weight of a journey. At dawn, in the far reaches of the countryside, farmers moved through fields heavy with dew. Their breath rose like smoke in the chill air as they guided plows drawn by oxen. The soil was dark and fragrant, rich with promise. Grain grew tall here, wheat for the king's bread, barley for his ale. These were sacred tasks, though the farmers themselves seldom thought of them that way. They worked because they must, because the rhythm of the seasons allowed no pause. Each handful of seeds scattered upon the earth was a prayer, though few would ever call it one aloud. When harvest came, carts groaned under the weight of golden stalks, and millstones turned ceaselessly to grind the grain that would one day become the royal loaf, crusted and white, served upon silver. Beyond the fields, in the shaded forests, hunters tracked deer through mist and shadow. Their arrows flew silently, guided by instinct and hunger. The animals they caught were dressed and carried to the castle's gamekeepers, who kept vast stores of venison, boar, and pheasant hanging in cool cellars. These meats would feed nobles through the winter and grace the table during festivals. The hunters rarely saw the feasts their efforts supplied. They lived on rough bread and salted pork, their bellies empty while the nobility dined on the fruits of their skill. Yet, in their way, they too served the kingdom's order, invisible pillars supporting the weight of a gilded crown. In the villages, bakers woke long before dawn. They kneaded dough by candlelight, the smell of yeast thick in the air. The sound of their work was rhythmic, meditative, the steady slap of dough upon wood, the hiss of ovens. Their bread was humble compared to the white loaves of the court, but the same grain, the same earth, the same toil made both possible. The bread of the king was simply refined more, sifted through finer cloth, its purity a mark of distinction. The difference was not of flavor but of status. One loaf fed hunger, the other proclaimed divine favor. The bakers knew this truth but spoke of it rarely. In their silence was both understanding and endurance. Farther still, in bustling towns near the sea, merchants loaded ships bound for distant shores. The harbors smelled of salt and spice, of rope and tar. Wooden crates were filled with pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, saffron, the treasures of the East. These goods came from lands few in Europe would ever see, traveling along dangerous routes through deserts, mountains, and oceans. The merchants who survived the journey returned home changed, their faces weathered by sun and wind, their purses heavy but their eyes wary. The spices they brought were worth their weight in gold, destined not for common stews or broths, but for the royal kitchens where they would transform simple meat into symbols of wealth and mystery. To season food with pepper or saffron was not a matter of taste, it was a declaration of empire. Within the castle walls, the kitchen was its own world, loud, smoky, alive with movement. Cooks barked orders, their faces slick with heat. Spits turned slowly over great fires, dripping fat into the flames. Pots as large as barrels simmered with broth, the air thick with the scent of herbs and roasting meat. Apprentices ran back and forth carrying baskets of onions, bundles of parsley, sacks of flour. The scullions, the lowest of the kitchen ranks, scrubbed pots until their fingers bled, their backs bent over cold water. None of them would ever dine at the tables they served, yet their labor was essential. Without them, no feast could exist. The kitchen was a kingdom within a kingdom, ruled not by crowns but by skill and endurance. In another chamber, the royal steward recorded every delivery and expense. Quills scratched over parchment as he measured the value of each barrel and bushel. His work was quiet but crucial, ensuring that no spice was wasted, no silver misplaced. For the steward, the feast was not about splendor or celebration. It was a balance of numbers, a fragile harmony between plenty and ruin. He knew better than most how much the illusion of abundance cost. Behind every lavish meal lay debts, harvests, and the labor of thousands. And though the guests at the feast saw only luxury, the steward saw a delicate machine that could collapse with a single failed crop or a ship lost to storm. As the sun climbed higher, caravans began their slow procession toward the castle gates. Carts laden with goods creaked along the winding roads, wheels sinking into mud. Drivers shouted to one another as they passed, tradesmen, farmers, and drovers, all bound for the same destination. Chickens squawked, horses snorted, and the air smelled of hay and sweat. The roads themselves were arteries, carrying the lifeblood of the kingdom toward its glittering heart. Without them, the royal court would starve, not for lack of food, but for lack of connection. The feast was not just a meal. It was the end of a chain that stretched across the land like an invisible thread binding all lives together. When evening came and the supplies were finally delivered, the castle gates closed, sealing the world outside. Inside, the cooks worked late into the night. The fires roared, shadows danced upon the stone walls, and the first aromas of the coming feast began to rise: roasted meat, baked bread, the sweetness of wine. The servants moved in silence, their bodies tired but their motions precise. They knew their work would never be praised, but there was a strange satisfaction in it nonetheless. To serve the feast was to be part of something greater, even if one remained unseen. By dawn, the kitchens fell silent. The floors were scrubbed, the last crumbs swept away. Outside, the sky was pale and endless, the fields stretching into mist. Somewhere, a farmer leaned on his plow, unaware that the fruit of his labor would soon rest upon a royal plate. Somewhere else, a merchant's ship creaked against its moorings, its cargo of spices locked away behind iron bolts. Across the land, the machinery of the feast turned quietly on, an endless cycle of effort and desire. And when the first bell rang for morning prayer, the cooks stirred once more, preparing for the day when the king would dine again, his table laden with the world, his people bound by the invisible thread of hunger and devotion. The great hall waited like a sleeping giant, quiet and expectant beneath its high-arched beams. Torches flickered against the stone walls, their flames whispering in the cool air. The scent of pine smoke mingled with that of beeswax candles and freshly scrubbed floors. Servants moved through the space in soft procession, their footsteps muffled by thick rushes strewn across the floor. Outside, twilight had deepened into indigo, and a soft rain began to fall, tapping against the windows like a slow, rhythmic drum. It was the hour before the feast, that fragile moment when anticipation hung heavier than music, when the kingdom itself seemed to hold its breath. At one end of the hall, long tables stood ready, draped with linen as white as frost. Silver platters gleamed beneath the torchlight, polished until they reflected the dancing flames. Golden goblets waited to be filled, their rims engraved with tiny crowns and patterns of vines. Each plate had its place, each knife and spoon perfectly aligned, as though symmetry itself might please the gods. The air was hushed, filled only with the faint creak of wood and the sigh of fabric as servants adjusted the royal chair one last time. The king's seat, raised upon a dais, loomed over the hall like a silent sun, casting order upon everything beneath it. In the kitchens below, the final preparations were reaching their crescendo. Cooks shouted over the roar of fire, their voices blending with the hiss of boiling pots and the clatter of ladles. The scent of roasting meat filled the corridors, rich and intoxicating. Servants rushed up and down the narrow stairs, carrying trays, pitchers, and bowls. Outside the door to the hall, they paused, straightened their tunics, and drew deep breaths before stepping into the candlelight. Inside, perfection was demanded. Every movement was part of a silent choreography honed through generations, an unspoken rhythm that connected the humblest servant to the royal crown. As the first guests began to arrive, the silence broke like glass. The heavy doors opened, and a rush of sound and warmth filled the space. The courtiers entered in a slow, graceful line, their garments a river of color, silks and velvets shimmering in the firelight. Jewels caught the light like falling stars. Each guest bowed before the dais before taking their seat, eyes flickering upward toward the king's empty chair. Musicians tuned their instruments in the corner, plucking soft notes from lutes and fiddles that drifted through the air like the scent of spice. The hum of conversation began to swell, blending with the faint rustle of fabric and the distant crackle of the hearth. Above, the banners of the kingdom swayed gently in the draught. Emblazoned with lions, crosses, and crowns, they told stories of lineage and conquest. Beneath them, servants lit more candles, one by one, until the hall glowed like a cathedral. The lights softened the faces of the guests, smoothed the hard lines of armor, and turned the silver of the cutlery into rivers of pale fire. Time seemed to slow. Each flicker of flame, each note of music, each whispered word built toward the moment when the feast would begin, the moment when food and ceremony would merge into something greater than either. A hush fell as the royal procession entered. The king appeared first, robed in deep crimson trimmed with fur, his crown gleaming under torchlight. The queen followed, serene and radiant, her hair bound with pearls. Behind them came the young princes and princesses, and then the lords and ladies of the court. Every head bowed as they passed. The king moved slowly, his steps echoing through the hall, his presence commanding yet calm. When he reached his seat, he paused, resting one hand upon the back of his chair before turning to gaze across the gathered faces. In that silence, every breath seemed to wait upon his word. Then, with a simple nod, he sat, and the hall exhaled. The first sound was music. A low, reverent melody rose from the corner where minstrels played, a tune both ancient and new, familiar yet mysterious. The strings quivered softly, joined by the gentle pulse of a drum. The rhythm spread through the room like a heartbeat. Servants began to move again, their motions flowing with the music, carrying in platters and pitchers in perfect synchrony. The first course was not yet served, but the ritual had begun. The feast was as much about timing as taste, as much about grace as grandeur. Every gesture was a performance, every silence a pause in a sacred script. The chaplain stepped forward, raising his hands to offer blessing. His voice was low and sonorous, a river of words that rolled through the chamber, echoing off the stone. He spoke of gratitude, of abundance, of the divine harmony that brought harvest and peace. Heads bowed, eyes closed, and for a brief moment, the hall was united in stillness. The prayer ended, the torches crackled louder, and the first servants entered bearing great basins of water for hand-washing, a ritual both practical and symbolic. Each guest dipped their fingers into the perfumed water, wiping them dry on fine linen. The fragrance of roses and herbs drifted upward, mingling with the scent of roasting meat. As the king lifted his goblet, all conversation ceased. The hall waited, poised between silence and celebration. He raised the cup high, its contents dark and glimmering. "To life and to providence," he said softly, his voice carrying easily through the chamber. The guests echoed the words, their voices blending into a single, resonant hum. Then at last they drank. The first sip was like a spark. Laughter followed, low at first, then rising like wind through trees. The music swelled again, faster now, brighter. The servants re-entered with the first dishes: bread, cheese, bowls of steaming broth, each one placed in precise order. The feast had begun, and with it, the illusion of eternity returned. Yet beneath the splendor, there was something fragile, a tension too subtle to name. The flicker of the flames seemed almost anxious, their light stretching too far, too thin. Outside, the rain had turned to wind, and it howled softly through the cracks in the great doors. A chill drifted in, unnoticed by most but felt by a few. The fire crackled louder, and a servant hurried to add more wood. For now, warmth held dominion, and the world beyond those stone walls could not intrude. The hall was alive again, breathing, glowing, pulsing with joy. But somewhere in the distance, beyond the reach of light or laughter, the first tremors of change had already begun to stir. And so the banquet hall awakened fully, radiant, alive, and unaware that this night, like all others, was both a celebration and a farewell. The music, the laughter, the scent of bread and wine, all wove together into something timeless, something that would linger long after the candles burned low. The feast was a memory being made, one destined to survive the centuries, shimmering faintly in history's mirror long after the torches had gone cold. The storm outside had grown restless, its voice echoing faintly through the stone corridors like a warning whispered in the dark. The wind pressed against the windows of the castle, rattling the shutters as if trying to gain entry. Yet within the grand hall, the warmth of the fire and the hum of music drowned out the world beyond. The feast continued in full splendor, golden platters refilled, goblets replenished, laughter swirling through the air like smoke. Every face glowed with firelight, every gesture moved in rhythm to the flicker of the torches. Yet beneath the brightness, something unseen lingered, a quiet unease that even the wine could not drown. At the head of the table, the king sat with a distant look in his eyes. His smile was measured, his laughter faint. The courtiers mistook it for contemplation, but those who knew him well could see the strain behind his stillness. His fingers drummed softly on the arm of his chair, a slow, unconscious rhythm that betrayed his restlessness. Across from him, the queen observed him in silence. Her gaze was steady, her poise unbroken, yet there was a question behind her calm, one that neither dared to voice in public. The music softened, the torches hissed, and for a fleeting moment, the air seemed to shift, as if the walls themselves were listening. Among the guests, whispers began to circulate. Some spoke of the kingdom's borders, where winter had arrived early and the harvest had failed. Others murmured of omens, strange lights seen in the northern sky, voices heard in the woods at night. Yet no one dared to speak too loudly. The king's court was a place of masks and manners, where truth walked in shadows and rumor wore a crown. Still, unease moved like a current beneath the tablecloths, passing from one face to another, hidden behind polite smiles and toasts. Even the jester's laughter sounded forced, the rhythm too sharp, the mirth too hollow. At the far end of the hall, a minstrel began a new song, an old one, about a hero who ventured into darkness to bring back light. His voice was low, trembling slightly, but his words carried clearly through the chamber. The melody was haunting, echoing off the stone and lingering in the arches above. As he sang, the flames in the torches seemed to waver, bending as though to listen. The courtiers fell silent, drawn into the story's pull. The verses spoke of courage and betrayal, of a king who sacrificed his heart for his people. The song ended not with triumph, but with a warning that light, once given away, can never truly be reclaimed. When the final note faded, no one applauded. The silence that followed was deep and uneasy. The king's gaze lingered on the minstrel. "Where did you learn that song?" he asked quietly. The minstrel bowed low. "It is an old tale, my liege, older than the stones of this hall." The king nodded slowly, his eyes darkening. "Then it is older than truth itself," he murmured. The court did not understand his words, but they felt their weight. The queen placed her hand gently upon the table, her ring catching the light. "Perhaps the song is a reminder," she said softly, "that even kings must listen when the past speaks." Her voice was calm, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of something deeper, a fear not of the present, but of what might return. The storm thundered again, closer now. The windows shook, and a sudden draft swept through the hall, extinguishing several candles at once. Shadows leapt across the walls, long and distorted. A murmur rippled through the guests. Servants hurried to relight the candles, but for a brief, shuddering instant, the hall was cloaked in half-darkness. The flickering light made the faces of the diners seem strange, their smiles warped, their eyes too hollow. The musicians faltered, their notes stumbling into silence. Only the crackle of the fire remained, loud and uneven. The storm outside seemed to breathe in time with the flames, its rhythm growing closer, heavier, more deliberate, like footsteps echoing through a dream. Then, from the far end of the hall, a sound came, a slow, measured knock. 3 times against the great oak doors. The hall froze. Every conversation, every movement, died at once. The guards exchanged uncertain glances. The knocking came again, louder this time, echoing through the vaulted ceiling. The king rose slowly, his chair creaking behind him. "Who dares approach at this hour?" His voice carried authority, yet even he could not hide the faint tremor in it. One of the guards bowed and moved toward the doors, his armor glinting faintly in the firelight. The crowd watched in silence, breathless, as he drew back the iron bolt. The doors opened to reveal a figure standing in the threshold, cloaked, hooded, and drenched from the rain. The stranger's face was hidden, but his voice, when he spoke, was clear and deep. "Forgive my intrusion, my lord," he said, bowing low. "But I bring tidings from the north, tidings that cannot wait for dawn." The king studied him carefully. "Then speak," he commanded. The stranger stepped forward, his boots echoing on the stone. Water dripped from his cloak, pooling darkly on the floor. "The northern watch has fallen," he said simply. "The old road is lost, and the fires we saw in the sky have come closer. The darkness moves faster than we thought." A murmur rippled through the hall, soft but sharp. The king's face hardened. "And what of my men?" The stranger hesitated. "Gone, my lord. All of them. Only the wind remains." For a long moment, no one spoke. The fire crackled weakly, and the storm outside seemed to laugh. The queen's hand gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. The king lowered his gaze, his jaw tightening. "Then it begins," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. The signs were true. He turned to his steward. "Send word to the council. At dawn, we prepare." The minstrel bowed his head, clutching his instrument as though it might protect him. The courtiers began to whisper again, their voices rising in nervous fragments. Disbelief, fear, denial. The stranger stood motionless in the doorway, the rain still dripping from his cloak. For a brief moment, the firelight caught his eyes beneath the hood, not human eyes, but something darker, glinting like obsidian. And then, as quickly as he had come, he turned and vanished into the storm. The doors closed behind him with a heavy echo that lingered in the silence. No one spoke after that. The feast continued, but its spirit was gone. The laughter was forced, the wine no longer sweet. Even the musicians played softer, their melodies uncertain. The torches flickered as though tired. The king sat in silence, his thoughts far from the warmth of the hall. Beyond the castle walls, the storm raged, and somewhere in the distance, unseen and unspoken, the first shadow of what was coming moved through the darkness, drawing ever closer to the light that burned within these fragile walls. The morning that followed was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. The storm had passed, leaving the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and ash from the torches that had burned through the night. Mist rolled across the hills, clinging to the battlements and winding around the trees like a living thing. Inside the castle, servants moved softly, their footsteps careful, their voices hushed. The feast's remnants still lay upon the tables, goblets overturned, platters of fruit gone dull, the golden peacock now only bones. The hall that had once glowed with laughter seemed hollow, its grandeur dimmed. Even the fire, once roaring with warmth, burned low and tired, its last embers sighing into gray. The king had not slept. His eyes, hollow beneath their crown of silver hair, stared into the pale light filtering through the stained glass. The council had gathered before dawn, grim men in heavy cloaks, their faces drawn with worry. Maps were spread across the table, covered with marks and ink stains. The air smelled of wax, parchment, and unease. No one spoke at first. The only sound was the scratch of the steward's quill as he wrote down orders no one truly believed would matter. Finally, the king broke the silence. "If the northern watch is gone," he said quietly, "then the road is open. Whatever rides that wind will not stop at our borders." The council exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a bishop draped in white, clasped his hands together. "Perhaps, my liege, it is not war that approaches. Perhaps it is judgment." The words hung in the air like smoke. No one dared to challenge them outright, yet the room seemed to shift with discomfort. The queen, seated beside the king, turned her gaze to the window. Outside, the mist thickened, swallowing the fields and forests beyond. "Judgment or not," she said softly, "it has found the roads we built." Her tone carried both grace and quiet sorrow, the kind of acceptance that comes when denial is no longer possible. The king closed his eyes for a moment, as though her words struck something deep within him. When he opened them again, his voice was steady. "Then we will meet it as we have met every trial before, with faith and with fire." Messengers were sent out before the sun had fully risen. They rode into the mist, their figures fading like ghosts into the gray. Orders spread through the villages. Watchtowers were to be lit again, gates repaired, supplies gathered. But beneath the surface of discipline and duty, a quiet fear began to take root. Farmers whispered in the fields of strange deaths among the cattle, of cats and dogs found lifeless without wound or reason. In the markets, Merchants refused to handle goods from foreign ships. The very air seemed wrong, heavier somehow, as if the world itself had begun to rot in slow motion. Yet life went on because it had to. The peasants sowed. The bakers baked. The bells still rang for prayer. And each night, the castle's torches were lit, though their flames seemed smaller than before. The royal kitchens were busier than ever. The queen had ordered another feast, not of celebration, but of defiance. "If darkness comes," she said, "then it will find us living." Cooks worked from dawn until dusk, their hands trembling as they prepared dishes fit for gods: roasted lamb with cloves, sugared oranges, marzipan shaped like roses. The smells filled the corridors, sweet and heavy, mingling with the scent of damp stone. Servants whispered as they worked, glancing over their shoulders as though expecting to see something waiting in the doorway. They told tales of the stranger who had arrived in the storm, of his dark eyes and the shadow that followed him. Some said he was a messenger of death, others that he was an omen of the old world ending. Either way, they crossed themselves when they spoke his name. As the feast hour approached, the great hall was lit once more, though the air this time felt colder, the light less golden. The guests entered more quietly, their laughter subdued, their smiles uncertain. The musicians played softer songs, slow melodies that drifted like memory through the air. The king took his seat, his expression unreadable. Across from him, the queen lifted her goblet, her fingers trembling slightly. "To life," she said, her voice breaking the silence. "To the breath that still fills us, and to the sun that still rises." Her toast was met with murmurs, hesitant but sincere. The wine tasted bitter that night, though no one dared to say why. Midway through the feast, one of the servants stumbled, dropping a tray of golden plates. The crash echoed like thunder, and the hall fell still. The servant knelt, trembling, stammering apologies, but the king waved him away gently. "Leave it," he said, his tone weary. "There will be other plates." It was meant as kindness, but something in his words felt final, as though he no longer believed in abundance. The musicians resumed their playing, but their notes wavered, uneven, as if the air itself resisted melody. A faint chill crept into the room. Some guests shivered, others drew their cloaks tighter. Outside, the mist had thickened, pressing against the glass like a living thing. Then came a sound, faint, distant, almost like a sigh carried on the wind. A horse whinnied in the courtyard. Somewhere, a dog began to bark and then fell silent. The torches flickered, their flames stretching upward before shrinking low. The queen looked toward the window and frowned. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. The king nodded, his eyes fixed on the dark beyond the glass. "Yes," he said. "The world is breathing differently tonight." The music stopped once more. A servant hurried to the window, but before he could reach it, the glass began to tremble, softly at first, then harder, as if struck by invisible hands. The candles guttered out, one by one, until only the fire in the hearth remained. A low moan rose from the courtyard, not quite human, not quite wind. It was a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, deep, ancient, sorrowful. The guests clutched their hands in prayer, their voices breaking into frightened whispers. The king rose, his face pale but resolute. "Enough," he said. "We will not tremble before shadows." But his voice shook as he spoke. The queen stood beside him, her expression calm but her eyes wet with tears. "Then let us pray," she murmured, "for whatever comes is already here." Outside, the mist began to move. It rolled through the gates, silent and deliberate, crawling across the stones like a tide. The guards at the wall shouted, their torches swallowed by gray. Horses screamed, chains rattled, and then, nothing. Just silence. Heavy, perfect, complete. Inside the hall, the fire flared once, bright as the sun, then dimmed to embers. The guests clung to one another, their fine clothes rustling like leaves. The air grew colder. And in that breathless stillness, as if the world itself had stopped to listen, the first faint scent of rot drifted in through the cracks, unnoticed by most, but unmistakable to those who would remember this night for generations to come. The scent of the end, soft and patient, had arrived. Morning did not come gently that day. The mist that had crept into the castle grounds during the night did not lift with the dawn. Instead, it thickened, coiling around the walls like a second skin. The sun, pale and distant, hung behind a veil of gray, casting no warmth. Birds did not sing. The world seemed caught between waking and sleep, a stillness too complete to be natural. In the villages below, doors remained closed, shutters latched, and hearths burned low. The people spoke little, as if afraid that words themselves might call forth what they feared. Something unseen had arrived, not yet named, not yet understood, but already spreading like a shadow across the heart of the land. At first, it began with whispers, stories carried by merchants and travelers, voices trembling as they spoke of strange deaths in distant towns. A farmer found lifeless in his field, his face blackened as though kissed by fire. A young mother dead beside her child, her body swollen and dark. A ship arriving in harbor with its entire crew silent and still, the rats spilling from its hold like fleeing souls. The tales reached the castle in fragments, dismissed at first as superstition. Yet as the days passed, the stories multiplied. The king ordered his guards to block the northern road. Priests held longer masses. The markets emptied, the laughter faded, and fear began to settle where once there had been faith. Inside the royal court, unease grew heavy. The king sat for hours in silence, his fingers pressed against his temples, his thoughts clouded. He had known war, famine, rebellion, but this was something else, something without form or face. It could not be fought with swords or silenced by decree. The queen watched him with quiet dread, seeing in his stillness the reflection of a truth neither dared to say aloud, that the kingdom was no longer safe. The servants, once lively and talkative, now moved like ghosts through the corridors. They avoided each other's eyes, their hands trembling as they worked. The great hall that had echoed with music and laughter only nights ago now stood empty, its silence a kind of mourning. Outside, the sickness moved swiftly. It began in the port towns, places where ships docked from the east, their holds filled with goods, grain, and death. The air there grew foul, heavy with a stench no prayer could cleanse. Then came the rats, bold and numerous, their small eyes glinting in the torchlight as they slipped through streets and cellars, carrying the unseen curse. The priests called it a test from God, the scholars called it corruption of the air. But to the people, it felt like punishment, for greed, for pride, for the sins of kings. No one truly understood, yet everyone felt it. The world was changing, unraveling quietly beneath their feet. In the castle kitchens, panic spread in whispers. A cook had fallen ill, feverish, trembling, muttering nonsense before his body went cold by morning. The head steward ordered the area burned, every utensil thrown into the fire. But the fear could not be burned away. Soon another servant fell, then another. Their bodies were carried out under night's cover, wrapped in coarse linen and buried beyond the walls, where the ground was wet and unwilling. The smell lingered in the air, sharp and metallic. The queen began lighting candles in every room, their small flames flickering like fragile hope. "If light cannot save us," she said softly to her ladies, "then at least it will remember us." The king summoned the court physician, a man of learning and calm. He examined the sick and returned pale-faced, his confidence stripped away. "It is not natural," he said. "It moves faster than thought. A single breath, a single touch, and it travels. The body burns from within." He hesitated before speaking again. Even the healthy begin to sicken after tending the dead. The word struck the hall like a blow. For the first time, the king's composure broke. He rose from his chair and turned away, gripping the stone wall as if to steady himself. "Seal the castle," he ordered hoarsely. "No one enters, no one leaves." The command echoed through the corridors, carried on the trembling voices of servants who no longer dared to speak above a whisper. Days bled into one another. The mist outside did not clear. It clung to the castle, a gray shroud that turned day into twilight. The bells in the nearby town rang often now, slow, mournful tolls that drifted through the valley like sighs. The people began to abandon the roads, their carts left behind, their homes boarded up. The kingdom that had once been proud and alive now seemed haunted, its every sound swallowed by stillness. The priests walked the streets with incense and prayers, but even their faith seemed dimmed. Some said the end of days had come. Others whispered that it was the earth's revenge, the world taking back what had been stolen from it. One night, the queen awoke to the sound of distant crying. She rose from her bed, the room lit only by the dull glow of dying embers. The sound came from beyond her chamber, soft, broken, human. She followed it through the darkened corridor until she reached the chapel. There, before the altar, knelt the king. His crown lay beside him, his hands clasped tightly in prayer. "How many?" she asked quietly. He did not turn. "Too many," he whispered, "and more each dawn." His voice cracked, thin with exhaustion. "They say even the priests are falling now. No one is spared." The queen placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then let us not rule with fear," she said. "Let us be seen. Let them know their king still lives." But his answer came only as silence. By morning, the sickness had reached the gates. A guard collapsed at his post, blood dark beneath his nails. The physician begged to burn the body, but the king refused. "He was loyal," he said. "He will rest as a man." Yet by nightfall, 2 more guards were gone. The castle's great doors were barred shut, yet the plague found its way in through cracks and breaths and hands. It was no longer something distant. It was here, inside the walls, inside the hearts of those who still clung to order. The grand tapestries, the jeweled goblets, the silver crowns, none of it mattered now. The air had grown thick with despair, with the quiet knowing that the world they had built would not survive this shadow. That night, as the king and queen sat by the fire, neither spoke. The flames cast their faces in gold and sorrow. Beyond the walls, the wind carried the sound of bells, one toll for each soul lost. The queen closed her eyes, her lips moving silently. The king stared into the fire until the colors blurred. "We feasted," he murmured at last. "We believed the world was ours." His voice was hollow, distant. "And now the world feasts on us." The fire cracked, sparks rising like stars, brief and dying. The queen took his hand, and for the first time he did not pull away. They sat in silence, 2 figures wrapped in the dim glow of what remained, a king, a queen, and the beginning of the end. The castle, once a sanctuary of power and grace, had begun to echo like an empty shell. The great corridors that once rang with the steps of nobles and laughter of servants now held only the soft shuffle of frightened feet. The scent of wax and smoke filled the air. Candles burned constantly, their light fragile against the growing darkness that seemed to press inward from every corner. The air was heavy with dampness, and the stones themselves seemed to sweat beneath the strain of what had come. The Black Death, though not yet named, had fully arrived, and it did not knock before entering. In the kitchens, the clatter of pots had stopped. The cooks were gone, the hearths extinguished. The smell of rot crept in where once there had been roasted meat and spiced wine. Even the dogs, once loyal and loud, had vanished, some into the woods, some found lifeless near the stables. The courtiers whispered that the air itself had turned venomous, that death lingered like an invisible fog, creeping into lungs and veins. The castle physician, pale and sleepless, moved from chamber to chamber with his herbs and prayers, but his touch was as futile as the words of the priests who followed him. The sick moaned softly behind closed doors, and the living learned to avert their eyes when passing through the halls. The queen still kept her composure, though her hands trembled when no one was watching. She ordered the servants to clean, to burn incense, to scrub the stone floors with wine. "If we live as though light still reigns," she told them, "then perhaps the dark will lose its strength." But no amount of scrubbing or incense could cleanse what had taken root. The illness spread not through filth alone, but through breath, through the very air that sustained them. No wall, no fire, no prayer could keep it out. It moved like a shadow cast by invisible wings, touching the noble and the peasant alike, leaving silence in its wake. The king spent his nights in the chapel now, praying beneath the gaze of stone saints whose eyes seemed to look past him. His words were broken, whispered, desperate. "If this is your punishment," he murmured to the altar, "then take me and spare them." But there was no reply, only the drip of wax and the low hum of wind through the stained glass. The priests had begun to vanish, too, some sick, some fled. Those who remained grew thin and hollow-eyed, their sermons weaker, their faith cracked. The chapel that once held songs of praise now echoed with coughs and sobs. The smell of incense was no longer holy, it was the smell of death's approach. Outside, the villages that had once fed the castle were dying. Smoke rose from pyres in the fields, where bodies were burned because the graves could no longer hold them. The air stank of ash and sickness. Birds no longer circled overhead, even the crows had gone quiet. Children disappeared from the roads, their laughter replaced by the silence of shuttered doors. Those who remained alive gathered in small groups, clutching one another and whispering prayers that sounded more like pleading than devotion. The world beyond the castle walls had become a vast cemetery of fear. Within the court, reality began to unravel. Nobles who had once competed for favor now avoided one another's gaze. They stopped attending councils. The feasts were gone, meals were taken in private, with hands gloved and hearts heavy. A rumor began to circulate that the sickness spared no bloodline, that even kings could fall as swiftly as beggars. The courtiers began sending messages to distant estates, hoping to flee before the gates closed for good. But when they tried to leave, they found the roads blocked by guards too frightened to let anyone pass. "The king's order," they said. "No one enters. No one leaves." Fear had sealed the kingdom tighter than any wall ever could. The queen's ladies, once vibrant with gossip and laughter, had become silent companions of grief. One by one, they vanished, some taken by fever, some slipping away in the night to search for family. The queen stopped asking where they went. She spent her days at the window, watching the fog cling to the hills, her reflection pale in the glass. She had once believed that faith and beauty could hold back despair, but now her prayers were as soft as sighs. When she slept, she dreamed of fields of wheat turning black, of rivers running thick as ink, of bells tolling without hands to ring them. The king's council, what little remained of it, met in secret chambers now. Their discussions were not of governance, but of survival. "It comes through the air," said one. "No," argued another, "through rats, through the grain." None agreed, and none dared to admit that it mattered little now. They spoke of hope as though it were a currency nearly spent. One night, the steward, once a man of logic and restraint, stood from his chair and said quietly, "Perhaps this is not sickness, but cleansing. The world has grown proud. Now it bows again." No one answered him. The silence that followed was not one of agreement, but of exhaustion. By the week's end, even the guards on the walls began to fall. The torches flickered but were no longer replaced. The castle, once a beacon of civilization, now stood like a tomb lit from within. The courtyards filled with the echo of empty wind. Windows were shuttered, doors bolted, tapestries drawn. Inside, the surviving servants burned lavender and rosemary until the air choked with the scent, hoping to disguise the stench of decay. But nothing could mask it anymore. The sweet, metallic smell of death that lingered everywhere, clinging to the stones, the sheets, even the air itself. And yet, in the heart of this dying world, life clung on, fragile, desperate, beautiful. In the queen's chambers, a single candle burned through the night. She would not let it die. She told herself that as long as it flickered, the kingdom still lived. The king visited her there one night, his face gaunt, his voice a whisper. "I have prayed until the words lost meaning," he said. Still, the silence answers. The queen looked at him with eyes that held no fear, only sorrow. "Then we must stop praying for the silence to speak," she said softly, "and start listening to what it already says." They stood together by the window, watching the fog move through the courtyard like a living dream. Below them, a bell rang in the distance, slow, uneven, a voice lost in the mist. The king's hand found hers, and for the first time in many nights, he did not pull away. "Do you think it will end soon?" he asked. The queen turned toward him, her expression unreadable. "Nothing truly ends," she said. "It only forgets to begin again." Her words hung in the air as the candle guttered low, the flame bending in the draught, thin but unbroken. Beyond the glass, the world was vanishing, But inside the chamber, for one fragile moment, the light still lived. Months passed, and the Viking ship burial became more than an archaeological project. It became a legend reborn in the modern age. The research findings were published, museum exhibits were curated, and documentaries began to follow the story with cinematic reverence. The once forgotten field was now a landmark, a sacred patch of earth visited by historians, students, and curious travelers. Yet for Anders, the discovery's true meaning was only beginning to unfold. He found himself returning again and again, standing alone at the site long after the world had turned its gaze elsewhere. Beneath the frost and silence, he could still feel the heartbeat of something greater, something alive. By early spring, the ground thawed, revealing faint traces of the trench's outline. Grass grew differently there, a subtle ripple marking where the ship had once rested. The field seemed to hum faintly, as though memory itself was blooming. Anders walked its perimeter slowly, his breath visible in the cold morning air. In his pocket, he carried a small piece of preserved oak, a fragment from the ship's keel that had broken away during preservation. He often held it between his fingers, feeling its rough surface like one might touch a relic of faith. For him, it wasn't just wood, it was a voice from across centuries. At the same time, new evidence from the lab reignited discussion about the identity of the person buried within. Carbon dating placed the burial in the late 9th century, an era of transition between pagan tradition and the slow encroachment of Christianity in Scandinavia. This revelation added new depth to the story. The burial ship, with its blend of Old Norse symbols and traces of cross-like motifs found on one metal fitting, suggested a time of dual belief, a world caught between gods and a new faith. Anders began to see the ship as more than a burial. It was a bridge between worlds, between old and new, light and darkness, sea and soil. Liv, ever the meticulous researcher, uncovered written records from medieval texts that spoke of a woman known only as the Seafarer Queen. The accounts were fragmentary, half legend, half memory, describing a ruler who united clans along the coast, whose wisdom was said to rival that of the gods. She was called the one who listened to the sea. Historians had long dismissed these references as folklore, but now, standing against the backdrop of the ship's evidence, the line between myth and truth began to blur. What if she was real? Liv said one afternoon, her voice trembling slightly. What if this is her? Anders didn't answer immediately. He looked out toward the horizon, where the faint outline of fjords shimmered in the distance. If it is, he said softly, then we haven't just found her grave. We've found her echo. He imagined her, standing on the shore 1,000 years ago, wind tearing through her braids, eyes fixed on the horizon. A queen, a seeress, a bridge between the human and divine. The ship had been her temple, her vessel, her eternity. And somehow, even now, it was still carrying her story across the ages. The museum exhibit opened that summer, featuring a full-scale digital reconstruction of the burial. The projected image of the ship filled an entire darkened hall, surrounded by soundscapes of waves and chanting. Visitors entered in silence, their footsteps softened by the darkness. In the center of the display, a glass case held the restored clasp, the twin beasts biting the ring of eternity. Its surface glimmered under soft light, and for many, it felt almost alive. People lingered in front of it, drawn by something they couldn't quite explain. Some described a feeling of warmth, others said it felt like standing on the edge of the sea. Anders watched from a distance, observing how the story touched those who came to witness it. He realized that the ship had fulfilled its purpose once again, not by carrying one soul into the afterlife, but by awakening countless others in the present. It was still sailing, only now through minds and imaginations. Every person who stood before the exhibit, lost in awe, became part of its voyage. In a quiet moment after the museum closed one night, Anders walked alone through the exhibition hall. The only light came from the holographic glow of the ship suspended above the floor. Its translucent hull shimmered, rippling like a reflection on water. He stood beneath it, listening to the soundscape, soft waves, creaking timbers, the faint rhythm of oars. It was all artifice, yet something about it felt deeply real. "You're still here," he whispered. "Still sailing." He placed his hand on the glass case holding the clasp, feeling its cold surface under his palm. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, just a flicker, as if light had caught the metal in a breath of motion. As he turned to leave, he noticed a young girl standing near the hologram, her parents waiting by the door. She was gazing at the ship with wide eyes, utterly still. Anders paused and asked gently, "What do you see?" The girl didn't look away. "She's not gone," she said simply. "She's dreaming." The words struck him harder than any scientific discovery could have. Out of the mouths of children came the truth adults so often forgot. The past never truly dies. It dreams in the present, waiting for someone to listen. That night, Anders couldn't sleep. He sat by his window, watching the moonlight reflect off the snow-covered city roofs. He thought about the ship, the woman, the centuries of silence, and how easily history might have buried it forever. Yet, somehow, it had endured. Against time, decay, and oblivion, it had endured. He realized then that the ship's real secret wasn't gold or power, it was remembrance. The Vikings had believed that to be remembered was to live forever. And through their devotion, they had achieved exactly that. In his final report, Anders wrote not as a scientist, but as a storyteller. The Viking ship, he began, was not meant to conquer the sea, but to preserve the soul. Its timbers have long since turned to dust, but its story endures, etched in earth, carried by wind, reborn in memory. We unearthed not a grave, but a promise, that the past is never truly gone. It waits beneath our feet, patient as the tide. Months later, when the museum exhibit began touring internationally, people from around the world stood in quiet reverence before the ship's ghostly image. They didn't just see wood and metal, they saw a reflection of themselves, a desire to leave something behind, to be known, to be remembered. The ship had become what it was always meant to be, a vessel for human meaning, carrying our stories across the sea of time. Years passed, yet the story of the buried Viking ship never truly faded. It wove itself into the cultural memory of Norway, spreading beyond the borders of archaeology and into art, poetry, and film. What had begun as a discovery in a quiet field had become something far greater, a symbol of continuity between the living and the dead, between time and eternity. Schools began teaching the tale of the Queen's voyage, museums built replicas, and even local folklore adapted to include new verses about the ghostly ship that once slept beneath the soil. For many, it became a story not just about Vikings, but about the unending human longing to be remembered. Anders, now older and slower in his steps, found himself invited to speak around the world. From Oslo to Kyoto, he shared the tale of the ship's unearthing, of the moment the soil split open and history exhaled. But each time he told the story, it changed slightly, not in facts, but in feeling. The more he spoke, the more he realized that what truly captivated people wasn't the archaeology itself, but the emotion behind it. It wasn't the burial chamber or the artifacts. It was the idea that someone, 1,000 years ago, had loved and believed enough to build an eternal vessel for remembrance. The ship was a mirror for everyone who feared being forgotten. He often recalled the first day of the dig, the silence of the field, the smell of wet soil, the heartbeat of discovery. He remembered Liv's excitement, the way her voice trembled as she spoke of the seafarer queen. Liv had since moved on to lead her own research team in Iceland, chasing whispers of another burial site, but they still exchanged letters. Sometimes, in her handwriting, Anders saw the same spark that had ignited in him years ago, the insatiable need to uncover truth, not for glory, but for connection. In one letter, she wrote, "The earth doesn't hide secrets, it preserves them for those who are ready to listen." He kept that letter in his journal. By now, the field where it all began had been transformed into a quiet heritage park. A low wooden walkway circled the original excavation site, surrounded by wildflowers that swayed gently in the coastal breeze. A simple plaque stood at the entrance. Here rested the seafarer queen, whose ship carried her beyond time. Visitors would walk slowly along the path, their voices hushed, their faces thoughtful. Some left offerings, small stones, runic carvings, even folded paper boats. It was as though people instinctively understood that the story demanded reverence. The ship might be gone, but its spirit still lingered. Anders visited the park often, usually alone. He would sit on a weathered bench overlooking the field and close his eyes. Sometimes, when the wind was just right, he swore he could hear the faint creak of timbers and the rhythmic whisper of oars. He never told anyone, of course. Some things are meant to stay between the living and the dead. One afternoon, a young student recognized him and approached shyly, holding out a notebook filled with sketches of Viking ships. "You're the one who found her, aren't you?" she asked. Anders smiled faintly. "No," he said after a pause. "She found us." In that moment, he realized how completely the story had transformed. It no longer belonged to him or to the academic community, it belonged to everyone. It had become folklore once again, just as it had been 1,000 years before. The Queen's journey had come full circle, from legend to discovery, from discovery to memory, and from memory back to legend. Every retelling was another wave, another motion of the oars carrying her name forward through time. And that, Anders thought, was the truest form of immortality. Late one evening, as twilight settled over the Norwegian landscape, Anders stood alone at the field's edge. The grass shimmered with dew, and mist curled low over the soil. The air smelled faintly of salt, though the sea was miles away. He felt a strange stillness, as if the world had paused to listen. Then, faintly, almost imperceptibly, came the sound of water lapping against wood. He closed his eyes and saw it in his mind, the Queen's ship, radiant under the moonlight, rising once more from the earth. He saw her standing at the prow, her hair lifted by the wind, her gaze fixed on a horizon no one else could see. She did not look back. She did not need to. Her voyage would never end. In the months that followed, Anders's health began to fade. He spent more time indoors, surrounded by notes, sketches, and old photographs of the excavation. On his desk, in a small glass case, lay the wooden fragment he had kept all these years, the piece of the ship's keel. Its edges were darkened with age, but its grains still shimmered faintly in the light. Sometimes he would reach out and touch it, feeling the story pulse beneath his fingertips. It was strange, he thought, how something once buried so deeply could still feel alive. One night, as rain drummed softly against the window, Anders opened his journal to the first page he had written the day they found the ship. His handwriting was younger then, more deliberate, filled with the urgency of discovery. He read the words slowly, aloud, as though conjuring an old spell. "We found the outline of a ship beneath the soil. It sleeps as though waiting for dawn." He smiled faintly, whispering to himself, "And now it's awake." When he passed away later that year, the museum dedicated a small alcove in his honor. Inside the display was his journal, the letter from Liv, and the wooden fragment, now labeled simply, part of the keel of the seafarer Queen's ship, discovered by Anders Nygaard. Visitors would pause there, reading his words, often unaware that they were standing on the same floor where the reconstructed holographic ship shimmered above them. It was a fitting symmetry, his life and the Queen's story forever intertwined, both remembered in the quiet hum of the exhibit. And so, the tale of the Viking ship continued, not as a relic of the past, but as a living current in human history. It whispered to those who listened carefully enough that memory is not bound by time, and that what we bury in the earth does not always remain asleep. Somewhere, deep beneath another field or along another coastline, other ships still waited, dreaming of the day when hands would brush the soil aside and light would touch their bones again. The seafarer Queen had shown the way. Her ship had crossed not just oceans, but centuries, carrying with it a message that outlived every name and nation. All things lost can be found again, if only someone remembers to look. Centuries passed, and the great castle stood as both ruin and monument, a sentinel of memory against the slow erosion of time. The once golden banners had long since turned to dust, the walls worn smooth by rain and wind. Yet beneath the moss and the ivy, its bones endured. Travelers from faraway lands still came to see it, to walk the same corridors where kings had dined and prayers had been whispered into the dark. No longer a palace, it had become something quieter, something purer, a vessel of remembrance. Each step upon its stone floors echoed with the weight of those who had once danced there, feasted there, mourned there. In spring, the surrounding valley came alive again each year, bursting with wildflowers that swayed in the same wind that once carried the scent of roasted meats and burning torches. The villagers nearby tended their fields, their laughter rising faintly to the castle's broken towers. Children played in the shadows of its walls, their voices mingling with the whispers of ghosts. To them, the plague and the feast were distant myths, half-believed stories told by elders beside the fire. They did not see tragedy in the ruins. They saw beauty, endurance, and the quiet persistence of life. A monastery had been built near the castle generations later, by monks who believed the land itself was sacred, not for the royalty it once hosted, but for what it had endured. They tended the old gardens, planting herbs and flowers in the same soil where the queen had once knelt. They gathered relics of the past, fragments of glass, tarnished spoons, the rusted edge of a goblet. Each item was polished and placed carefully within their small chapel, not as treasure, but as testament. Here, they would tell visitors, the living once feasted before the shadow came. And when it passed, they learned to be humble before their own hunger. At night, the monks prayed in silence, their chants low and rhythmic. They spoke not to forget the darkness, but to honor it. They believed the plague was not punishment, but passage, that the world had been stripped of its arrogance to find its soul again. The castle became a place of pilgrimage, not for royalty or scholars, but for those seeking peace. Farmers, widows, soldiers, even weary travelers on forgotten roads came to stand in the great hall, where the ceiling had collapsed and the stars shone through like candles in a cathedral without walls. Some wept. Some prayed. Most simply stood in silence, letting the air speak for itself. The paintings that once decorated the castle had faded, but faint outlines remained. A king raising his cup, a queen's gentle smile, a banquet table stretching into eternity. Dust and time had softened them into ghosts of color, but their meaning had only deepened. The feast had not vanished, it had transformed. Where once there was pride and laughter, there was now understanding. A kind of reverence that comes only from looking at ruin and seeing not what was lost, but what remains. Scholars came centuries later, drawn by curiosity. They catalogued bones found beneath the chapel floor, fragments of scripture hidden in walls, notes written in trembling hands during the height of the plague. "We are not forgotten," one note read, the ink barely legible. "If you find this, remember that we loved life." The words were preserved behind glass, but their meaning reached beyond the parchment. It was a whisper across time, a reminder that every feast, every joy, every sorrow, no matter how fleeting, leaves a trace. In one of the castle's upper chambers, long sealed by collapse and neglect, a discovery was made. Beneath a layer of rubble and dust lay a small wooden chest. Inside, wrapped in decayed cloth, were objects untouched for centuries: a goblet rimmed with gold, a ring with the royal crest, and a small diary, its pages warped but intact. The writing, faded but graceful, belonged to the queen. It was not a chronicle of kings or wars, but a reflection of her heart. She had written not of her crown, but of her people, of her gardens, of the silence that followed the feast. One passage, still legible after all those years, read, "When the music stopped, I thought the world would end. But in that stillness, I heard something greater, the heartbeat of the living." It was faint, but it was enough. That single line was carved into a marble plaque and placed in the castle's great hall. Pilgrims came to read it, some leaving flowers, others leaving bread or coins as quiet offerings. It became a custom, a symbolic meal for the dead and the living alike. Each year on the anniversary of the forgotten feast, the villagers gathered in the ruins with candles and food. They laid their meals upon long tables rebuilt from fallen timber, not in excess, but in unity. No one spoke loudly, no one wept. They simply ate together under the open sky, as the queen once had, not to celebrate wealth, but to remember endurance. The wind carried the scent of their simple meal, bread, soup, roasted vegetables, through the broken halls. Above, the stars gleamed like 1,000 eyes watching over them. For one night, the past and present seemed to exist together, woven into the same thread of time. The ghosts of the feast were no longer mourned or feared. They were welcomed. For in that moment, everyone understood what the Queen had once written, that even after the music ends, the heartbeat of the living continues, steady and eternal. And when the last candle burned low and the villagers began their slow descent back to their homes, the castle remained, watching, silent as ever. Its stones, though cracked and ancient, glowed faintly in the starlight, as if they still remembered the warmth of that long-ago evening, the laughter, the fear, the silence, and the fragile beauty of survival. The forgotten feast had not been forgotten at all. It had become something greater, a bridge across centuries, a reminder that every moment of life, no matter how fleeting, echoes forever in the halls of time. The Icelandic excavation marked the beginning of a new era. What had once been an isolated discovery now seemed part of a vast, interconnected story spanning generations and coastlines. The finding of the second ship reignited the world's fascination with Viking burials, sparking documentaries, global exhibitions, and even philosophical debates. Yet, beneath all the excitement, there was a quiet reverence, a sense that humanity had only begun to scratch the surface of what these ships meant. They were not simply graves or relics. They were vessels of memory, each one carrying echoes of those who had lived, dreamed, and defied the erosion of time. Eric's discovery drew comparisons to Anders's decades-old find. Scholars noted uncanny similarities: the curvature of the keel, the arrangement of burial artifacts, even the faint traces of pigment on the wood. But the Icelandic ship had one difference that set it apart. It seemed to have been deliberately unfinished. The carvings stopped abruptly near the stern, as though the builders had been interrupted or had intentionally left it incomplete. This puzzled the team, but Eric felt something else when he saw it, something wordless, emotional. It was as if the ship was not meant to carry a body, but a message. He often stood by the excavation at dusk, staring at the dark shape in the soil, feeling the same weight Anders once felt in Norway, the weight of connection across centuries. One evening, as the light faded and his crew packed their tools, Eric lingered. The wind was sharp, carrying the smell of the sea across the barren land. He crouched beside the ship's stern and ran his hand over the coarse surface of the wood. A thought formed in his mind, quiet, unbidden. She's still traveling. He didn't know if it was imagination or something deeper, but he felt a pulse beneath his fingertips, a faint hum in the air like the rhythm of distant oars. When he looked up, the sky was shifting colors, deep violet melting into silver. He could almost see her then, the seafarer queen, standing tall at the bow, her hair unbound, her eyes reflecting the horizon. She turned slightly, as if to acknowledge him, before dissolving into mist. Back in Oslo, news of the Icelandic discovery reached Liv. Though her body was frail and her health failing, her mind remained sharp. When she saw the first photographs of the unearthed ship, her breath caught. "She's still sailing," she whispered. She wrote one final letter to Eric, her handwriting trembling but resolute. "Do not dig only for what you can hold in your hands. Dig for what the earth remembers. Dig for the stories that do not die." The letter arrived at the Icelandic camp a week later, but by the time it did, Liv had passed away quietly in her sleep. Eric read her words beneath the northern lights, tears glinting in his eyes as the sky above him shimmered with colors that felt almost like a benediction. Months later, as the Icelandic project entered its final phase, Eric's team uncovered a small wooden chest near the bow of the ship. Inside were fragments of linen and a bronze disc etched with symbols, some Norse, others unfamiliar. When cleaned, the disc revealed an image, a ship encircled by two intertwined serpents, their tails forming a perfect ring. Around its edge, inscribed in runes, were words that took Eric days to translate. The phrase read, "The sea remembers what the land forgets." The message struck him like a revelation. It was the same motif found on the Norwegian clasp, the same philosophy that seemed to echo through every discovery. The Vikings had understood something profound, that memory was fluid, like water. It flowed through generations, reshaping itself, but never truly disappearing. In the years that followed, Eric's work became the foundation of what historians later called the Sea of Memory theory. It proposed that Viking burials were not isolated rituals but part of a larger metaphysical belief system, one in which the dead were not entombed but set adrift, their legacy carried forward through both spirit and story. The ship was the vessel, the story was the voyage. The theory resonated far beyond academia. Poets, filmmakers, and philosophers all found inspiration in it. The Queen's ship became a symbol of humanity's shared desire for continuity, a bridge connecting the ancient and the modern, the mortal and the eternal. Eric often returned to the Icelandic site even after the excavation ended. The ship had been carefully preserved and covered again, as was customary to protect it from decay. Standing over it, he felt the same calm that Anders once felt, the knowledge that some discoveries are not meant to end but to rest, waiting for another generation to awaken them. Sometimes, when the wind was quiet, he would whisper Liv's words aloud, "Dig for what the earth remembers." It felt like prayer. Years later, on the centennial of the first ship's discovery in Norway, an international exhibition was held that united both the Norwegian and Icelandic finds under one roof. The event drew millions. The two ships, represented as holographic reconstructions, faced each other across a vast hall, their translucent forms rippling like reflections on dark water. Between them hung the bronze disc from Iceland and the gold clasp from Norway, twin symbols suspended in timeless stillness. The lighting was soft, the sound of waves played low and constant. People walked through the exhibit in near silence, as though entering a temple. At the center stood a plaque engraved with a single line from Anders's journal. "We unearthed not a grave, but a promise, that the past is never truly gone. It waits beneath our feet, patient as the tide." Beneath it, smaller text in Old Norse read, "The sea remembers what the land forgets." Visitors lingered before it, many with tears in their eyes. Parents explained to their children that the Queen's ship had once been buried in darkness, waiting centuries to be seen again. The children listened with wide-eyed wonder, as though hearing a bedtime story. That night, when the exhibition lights dimmed and the hall emptied, the twin ships shimmered faintly in the darkness. The sensors powering their projections should have gone silent, yet for a brief moment, both glowed brighter, sails rippling, hulls gleaming. And then, faintly, came a sound that no one could explain later, the low, rhythmic creak of oars moving through water. The sound echoed softly, reverently, as if two ships were departing side by side, their shadows gliding across an invisible sea. The world moved on, but the Queen's voyage never ended. It lived on in stories, in museums, in quiet fields and restless waves. It lived in the hearts of those who dared to dig deeper, not for treasure, but for meaning. And somewhere, far beyond the horizon of time, the seafarer Queen still sailed, her ship forever cutting through the dark waters of eternity, carrying the memory of all who remembered her. Long after the exhibitions closed and the lights dimmed, the legend of the seafarer Queen continued to drift through time, no longer confined to museums or academic texts, but carried instead in whispers, stories, and dreams. Generations passed, and the once modern technology that had reconstructed her ship became obsolete. Yet the story endured. It appeared in children's storybooks, in folk songs sung by the sea, in the quiet prayers of sailors setting off into uncertain waters. Her name became less a title and more a symbol, a spirit of endurance, a keeper of memory, a promise that nothing truly vanishes beneath the tide of years. In a small coastal town near where the first ship was found, a new tradition began. Every midsummer night, the townspeople would gather by the shore carrying candles placed in wooden bowls. As twilight deepened into blue dusk, they set the bowls adrift upon the water, watching as hundreds of flickering lights bobbed gently on the waves. The ritual had no formal name, but everyone understood what it meant. It was a remembrance, not just for the Queen, but for all those who had gone before. Children would ask their parents, "Where do the lights go?" And the answer was always the same: they follow her. Among the crowd one year was a young historian named Sophia, a descendant of Anders Nygaard. She had grown up surrounded by his notebooks, sketches, and letters, though she had never met him. To her, he was a legend as much as the ship he uncovered. His handwriting, firm and deliberate, lined the pages of her childhood imagination. Now, standing by the water's edge, she felt that same quiet stirring, the weight of legacy pressing gently on her heart. When she looked out at the sea, the candle's reflections shimmered like stars scattered upon a dark sky. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw the faint outline of a ship's prow cutting through the mist. She blinked, and it was gone, leaving only ripples. Sophia had recently joined a maritime archaeology program, not to unearth gold or artifacts, but to continue the work her ancestor began, to listen to what the earth remembered. Her thesis focused on oral traditions and how memory persists long after physical traces vanish. She often quoted Anders's words, "The past is never truly gone. It waits beneath our feet." But in her interpretation, she added something new, "and within our hearts." For her, the seafarer queen wasn't just a historical figure, she was an embodiment of human yearning, a reflection of the universal desire to be remembered, to leave behind a trace that endures beyond the grave. Meanwhile, deep in the archives of the Oslo Museum, a curator discovered an unopened envelope among Anders's donated materials. The letter inside was addressed simply to "whoever continues the voyage." The handwriting was old, the ink faint but legible. It read, "If you are reading this, then the ship still sails. I do not know your name, but I know your heart. You too have heard her call, the pull that draws us to uncover what has been forgotten. Remember, we are not rescuing the past. It is rescuing us. The Queen's voyage is not only hers, it is ours. We sail each time we choose to remember, each time we tell her story again. When the soil gives way and the wood meets the air, it is not discovery. It is reunion." The letter was later displayed beside his journal in the museum. Visitors would often stand before it for long minutes, some quietly wiping away tears. The simplicity of his words carried a truth deeper than any scientific report could. The Queen's story was not about death, but return. Every rediscovery, every retelling, was another rising from the earth, another breath of life given to history. Sophia traveled to Iceland not long after. She wanted to see Erik's excavation site, to feel the same wind, to stand on the same soil that had once revealed a sleeping ship. The land was harsh and beautiful, streaked with black volcanic rock and moss-covered ridges. Standing at the site, she felt a strange peace, as though the air itself hummed with unseen presence. She knelt, pressing her palm to the ground, and whispered, "Thank you." The wind answered softly, curling around her like an embrace. It was impossible to tell if she imagined the faint sound of waves, but it felt real enough. Before returning home, Sophia visited the coastal cliffs where Erik had written his final notes. There, overlooking the endless expanse of ocean, she understood something Anders, Liv, and Erik had each discovered in their own time, that the voyage was not about reaching an end. It was about listening to the silence beneath the noise of life, the pulse beneath the earth, the stories that echo when everything else fades. The sea stretched out endlessly before her, vast and unknowable, yet alive with memory. Years later, when Sophia published her first book, she titled it, "The Sea Remembers." It was a meditation on time, legacy, and the invisible thread connecting the living to the long-departed. The book became quietly beloved, not for its academic rigor but for its grace. Readers described it as soothing, almost like a lullaby written for the soul. In her final chapter, Sophia wrote, "When I stand by the shore at night, I do not see emptiness. I see the glow of ships beyond sight, their sails woven from memory. I see the seafarer queen, still sailing, her vessel carried not by waves, but by hearts that refuse to forget. And in the hush between tides, I hear her voice whispering, 'Remember.'" Over time, her words joined the long lineage of the story. The field in Norway, the museum in Oslo, the volcanic plain in Iceland, all became part of a single map of remembrance. Pilgrims still visited each year, lighting candles, leaving flowers, sometimes just standing in silence. They didn't come for spectacle or fame. They came to feel something older than language, the unbroken continuity between all who have ever lived, dreamed, and left something behind. And if you were to stand there, in the quiet before dawn, you might feel it too. The faint rustle of wind through grass, the slow breath of the sea, and beneath it all, the pulse of something vast and ancient stirring in the soil. The ship still sails, unseen but eternal. Her journey never ends. It moves through every heart that listens, every hand that digs, every story that dares to remember. The Queen's voyage after all this time is not a tale of what was lost. It is a promise of what endures. As twilight descended upon the valley, the air grew still, and the scent of earth and memory mingled like incense. The last visitors of the day lingered near the memorial stone, their shadows stretching long across the grass. Somewhere beyond the hills, a bell tolled, slow, solemn, and distant, as though marking not an ending, but a continuation. The wind moved softly through the trees, carrying whispers that no one could quite hear yet everyone seemed to feel. In that quiet, the world seemed to breathe as one, the living and the long gone bound together by something deeper than time. A candle flickered beside the Queen's words, its flame trembling in the dusk, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if the light bent toward the earth, a gentle nod from the past to the present. Then the sky darkened fully, stars emerging like the memories of ages long faded. The valley fell into peace again, timeless and eternal, holding within it all that once was and all that would ever be. And in the hush between the stars and the soil, the heart of the forgotten feast continued to beat, quiet, steady, everlasting. Centuries later, when historians walked the same valley with careful steps and quiet wonder, they found traces of that vanished world beneath the grass. A fragment of carved stone, a rusted chalice, the faint outline of a hearth long cold, each relic whispered of lives once vivid. The scholars spoke in measured tones, writing notes and drawing maps, but in the hush between their words, something deeper stirred. The wind that swept across the ruins carried with it a strange warmth, as if the valley itself remembered. They said the soil felt alive, that when the evening sun dipped low, the light turned golden and still, touching every stone like an old friend. And in that moment, standing where kings had feasted and where silence had once fallen like a veil, the visitors understood what centuries of study could not, that history is not dead, but sleeping, waiting for those who listened softly enough to wake it. The valley, though quiet, was not empty. It breathed with the memories of all who had walked there, and in its eternal calm, the forgotten feast still lingered, not as sorrow, but as peace.